I think what's so striking to me is how this hexagram one, which it really speaks to us even now, like these big questions we all grapple with, finding true happiness, being our true selves. It's this fascinating intersection of ancient wisdom and modern, I don't know, almost like psychology.
So hexagram 1, it's called truth, force, key, creative.
Hmm.
How do those even connect to this whole idea of the false self and, everyone's quest to be happy?
Well, it's like the hexagram is giving us the starting line, right?
Yeah.
The framework. Like it's saying, listen, there's this powerful creative truth inside you, but, and this is the tricky part, it gets buried under what this source material calls the false self. And that's basically this identity we build up based on what other people think instead of really connecting with our true nature.
So we're talking about a kind of mask we wear for the world.
It's more than just a mask. It's like a whole persona we create and then believe is actually us.
Okay, so let's dive into this false self thing. The source material you gave me mentions 4 variations: NAC, NFC, NNP, NCP.
Each of these acronyms, they point to a pattern a lot of us will probably recognize in ourselves. So you've got the negative adaptive child, the NAC. They're driven by this need to please, clinging to rules, always looking for approval. Then there's the negative free child, the NFC. They're the rebel, right? They push against the rules. But even that rebellion, it's often still about getting validation, just in a different way.
So it's like 2 sides of the same coin. One's following the rules rigidly, the other's breaking them dramatically, but both are looking outside themselves for approval.
Exactly. And the source material gives these really great examples, like picture someone, maybe even yourself on a bad day, and they're totally fixated on every rule, norm, and expectation, RNE for short. Or they're desperate for a positive Jesse, that external judgment that gives their ego a boost, but it never lasts. That's the NAC in action. Then you've got the NFC who might outwardly reject all those RNEs, but they're still basing their actions on how others will perceive them.
So it's like they're both stuck in this performance, playing roles instead of just being who they are, authentically.
Exactly. And that's where the negative nurturing parent, NNP, and negative controlling parent, NCP, come in. They're like the inner voices of criticism and judgment that feed that need for external validation.
Ah, the inner critics.
Yeah.
We've all got those, right?
Yeah.
The ones whispering doubts and anxieties in our ears. Like having a whole negativity committee holding meetings in our heads sometimes. Okay, so we've got these 4 faces of the false self, each one trying to run the show and keep us locked in these patterns. So how do we break free? It's like we need the key to unlock that truth part of hexagram 1.
And I think the source material would say one of the biggest roadblocks is this tendency we have to put personal happiness above everything else. It even gives it an acronym, PPH, prioritizing personal happiness, which, on the surface sounds kind of strange, right? Like, aren't we supposed to want to be happy?
Yeah. Isn't that what, like, every self-help book tells us? So what's wrong with wanting to be happy?
Well, it's not that simple. When we're only focused on our own happiness, it can make us chase after things outside ourselves, always trying to manipulate our circumstances to feel good. And that's actually where a lot of suffering comes from. We get attached to things being a certain way and terrified of anything that messes with our comfort zone.
It's like we're always on this emotional treadmill, chasing that next hit of happiness, but never really reaching a place of, genuine contentment.
Right. And the source material actually refers to those fleeting moments of happiness as persistent unpleasant emotions, or PUEs. Instead of always avoiding those PUEs, which is what most of us are conditioned to do, we need to learn to make space for them, find a sense of peace even when things are messy and uncomfortable.
That makes sense. But how do we actually do that? How do we go from being ruled by our fears and insecurities to a place of, inner peace? It's got to be easier said than done.
Right. It definitely is. And that's where this idea of different levels of consciousness comes in. According to the source material, most of us operate at level 1, which is characterized by polarized thinking, that winner-take-all mentality.
So level 1 is being stuck in that back and forth between, say, the NAC and NFC, each one convinced it has the right answer, the key to happiness.
You got it. But here's the thing. Level 2, which is where we find this sense of equanimity, it's not about suppressing those parts of ourselves. It's about learning to relate to them in a whole new way.
So it's less about silencing those voices and more about, accepting them with compassion.
Exactly. And the source material calls this A3CBM, which stands for accept, acknowledge, appreciate with compassion, and beginner's mind.
I'm not going to lie, it sounds great on paper, but actually accepting those inner critics, those unpleasant emotions, that feels like, next level personal growth stuff.
Oh, absolutely. It's not like you just decide to be cool with those feelings and poof, it happens. It's more like think of A through CBM as a set of tools you can use, practices that can help you, shift how you relate to that inner world. Instead of constantly judging and resisting those thoughts and feelings, you can start to build a different kind of relationship with them, one that's based on kindness and understanding.
So where do we even begin? Like, let's say I'm feeling that familiar wave of anxiety or self-doubt. What's step one? Am I just supposed to welcome it with open arms?
Well, maybe not open arms right away, maybe more like a little nod of acknowledgement. See, what the source material talks about is how those tough emotions, they often trigger this urge to fight, flee, freeze, or fawn, the four Fs. It's like our primal response to discomfort, our inner cave person totally freaking out.
Right. When we feel threatened, we either want to run for the hills or come out swinging. But how do we move past those knee-jerk reactions and into that calmer, more conscious space of A3CBM?
That's where the accept part comes in. It's about acknowledging those feelings and urges without judgment. It doesn't mean we have to like them or pretend they're not there. We're just saying, okay, anxiety, I see you, I feel you.
Interesting. So it's more like acknowledging those feelings as visitors, even if they're not our favorite guests, not letting them take over the whole house.
Precisely. And that's huge because we often waste so much energy resisting those uncomfortable emotions, which ironically just makes them stronger. Trying to hold a beach ball underwater, the harder you push it down, the more forcefully it pops back up.
Right, like trying to ignore a screaming toddler. They'll just scream louder. Okay, so we're accepting the feelings, but what about the thoughts that come with them? I mean, let's be real. Our minds can be pretty brutal, especially when those inner critics, the NNP and NCP, get going.
Absolutely. And that's where acknowledge and appreciate come into play. We acknowledge those thoughts, those often really nasty narratives we tell ourselves, but we don't let them sweep us away. And get this, we can even try to appreciate those thoughts.
Appreciate them. You mean like be grateful for our inner critics?
Not grateful exactly, more like see them for what they are. Those thoughts are often just clumsy attempts to protect us, even if they're based on outdated programming or, completely irrational fears.
Okay, so instead of getting sucked into that spiral of self-criticism, it's more like we can observe those thoughts with a bit of distance, like watching a movie, knowing it's not actually real life.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we are not our thoughts. We have a choice in which thoughts we engage with, which ones we give power to.
That makes a lot of sense. And the compassion in beginner's mind, part of A3CBM, that feels really essential here, especially when we're talking about those ingrained patterns of self-criticism. It's easy to beat ourselves up for not having it all figured out.
100%. Compassion is like this superpower that lets us be kind to ourselves even when we mess up, when we feel like we're falling short. We're all works in progress, right? Constantly learning and evolving. And that's where the beginner's mind comes in. It's about approaching ourselves and our experiences with curiosity and openness, not judgment. We're giving ourselves permission to be imperfect, to stumble and learn along the way.
So we're trading in that inner drill sergeant for a more supportive coach, right? Someone who's in our corner, encouraging us to keep going even when things get tough.
I love that. It's about shifting from a space of self-criticism to one of self-compassion. And the thing about A3CBM is it's not a one-and-done deal. It's a practice. It's about learning to be there for ourselves with kindness and curiosity, especially when we're struggling.
So it's like building any skill. The more we practice, the easier it becomes to navigate those choppy emotional waters.
Exactly. And as we do that, something really amazing starts to happen. We start to loosen the grip of that false self we've been talking about. And we open ourselves up to the possibility of living from a more authentic, more connected place.
Which brings us back to Hexagram 1 with its emphasis on truth and creativity, right? It's like by doing this inner work, by learning to relate to our thoughts and emotions in a new way, we start to access this deeper well of, who we truly are.
You got it. And that's where things get really, really interesting. As we break free from the clutches of that false self, we open ourselves up to a whole new way of being in the world, one that's full of more peace, more connection, and yes, even more happiness. But it's not that fleeting conditional happiness that the false self is always chasing.
It's a happiness that comes from somewhere deeper, right? More authentic, more aligned with that truth that Hexagram 1 keeps pointing us toward. And you know what? I think we need to dive into that in our final act here.
Let's do it. This is where the journey really starts to get transformative.
All right, so we spent all this time talking about the false self and how it keeps us stuck, and we've got our A3CBM toolkit ready to, start dismantling those old patterns. But now I want to get to the good stuff, the real heart of it. This idea of the authentic self,
Hmm.
level 3 consciousness, wishing happiness for others, which, I'm not going to lie, feels kind of radical. Like, in a world obsessed with me, myself, and I, how do we even begin to wrap our heads around that?
It's a huge shift, right? Going from what's in it for me to actually wanting the best for others. It kind of turns everything upside down. But what the source material suggests, it's pretty wild actually, is that this shift, this is where we find the good stuff, the deep, lasting fulfillment.
Okay, I mean, that's a powerful idea, but it also feels like a pretty big leap, especially when those old patterns, the fears, the insecurities, they're always trying to pull us back into that self-centered bubble. So how do we bridge that gap?
Well, there's this concept the source material talks about, and it's about these three qualities: tamas, rajas, and sattva. You can think of them as like different energy states that we cycle through. So tamas is inertia, stagnation. Rajas is all about frantic action, restlessness. And then there's sattva, and that's like the sweet spot: balance, clarity, peace.
Okay, so Tamas is like being stuck in the mud, Rajas is like spinning in circles and getting nowhere, and Sattva is finding your center, right? That grounded, peaceful place inside. But how do these energies connect to the whole false self thing and, learning to genuinely want happiness for others?
That's the cool part. So the false self, with all its neediness and fear, it gets trapped in the extremes. The NAC, with its anxiety and need to control, it leans towards tamas. And the NFC, always needing attention, being impulsive, that's more on the Raja side. They're both on this seesaw, never really finding equilibrium.
So instead of that inner tug of war between different voices, it's like different energies battling it out inside us. And if I'm hearing you right, the key to tapping into that level 3 consciousness, that genuine desire to see other people happy, it's about cultivating sattva. It's about finding that inner balance.
About noticing when we get hooked by those extremes, by tamas or rajas, and then, gently guiding ourselves back to center, back to sattva, where things like clarity, compassion, wisdom, they can actually flourish.
Okay, so it's like we're training our minds to find that sweet spot, that sattva state. But like with any kind of training, I'm guessing it takes practice. So how do we actually strengthen that sattva muscle?
Well, this is where our friend A3CBM comes back into play. Remember those tools. They're not just for dealing with difficult emotions. They're also practices for cultivating sattva, shifting our energy from me, to a place of peace and connection.
So when we practice A3CBM, we're not just calming the inner storm, we're actually creating the conditions for this more balanced, harmonious way of being.
100%. And the source material even talks about this concept of wu wei, which is often translated as like non-doing or effortless action. And it's about aligning ourselves with the natural flow of life. It's not about forcing or resisting. It's about letting go of that need to control everything and trusting that there's something bigger at play.
Wu Wei. I've definitely heard that term before, but it's always felt kind of mysterious.
Yeah.
How does it connect to this idea of wishing happiness for others?
I think a good way to look at it is this. When we're totally consumed by our own wants and needs, when we're constantly trying to make everything go our way, it creates this like internal friction. We're pushing against the current, and that creates suffering. But when we practice Wu Wei, when we practice surrender and trust, we create space for things to just unfold naturally. And from that place of surrender, of alignment, we naturally become more open, more compassionate, more able to genuinely wish happiness for other people.
So it's like when we loosen our grip on how we think things should be, we make room for something new to emerge, something bigger. We become less self-absorbed and more connected to everything and everyone around us.
Exactly. And you know what else is interesting? The source material suggests that the obstacles we face, they're actually opportunities for growth and transformation. There's this whole idea that the obstacle is the way. So those moments of discomfort, those persistent, unpleasant emotions we talked about, those aren't roadblocks. They're invitations to practice everything we've been discussing. A3CBM, cultivating sattva, embracing wu wei.
So instead of seeing challenges as setbacks, we can choose to see them as chances to practice these principles, to get stronger, to move closer to that state of being where wishing happiness for others is as natural as, breathing.
Exactly. It's a lifelong journey, of course. But even small steps in this direction can make a world of difference, not just in our own lives, but in the lives of those around us too.
And that is a beautiful note to end on. Thanks for diving deep with us today. Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking those big questions.